Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Audrey Lichter, Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, a resource center for Jewish engagement. Scholars Circle is one of our programs. Today's Scholars Circle features Dr. Olga Kirschbaum-Shirazki on Friends of Israel Post-10, exploring trends and developments. In addition to our work with Scholars Circle, Chai Mitzvah's mission is to increase Jewish engagement through small group learning. We have over 20 discussion guides geared toward meaningful and intimate conversations around Jewish text. We especially like to work with synagogues, JCCs, and federations. To date, over 9,000 people have participated in our programs, and we have worked with over 70 legacy organizations. Please visit our website and contact us to learn more about how to reignite your Jewish learning and increase engagement in these important organizations. Please go to chaimitzvah.org. The Scholars Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea, our founder and board president, who authored the best-selling book, Conspiracy U, A Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the left and right political spectrum. Scholars Circle has engaged over 5,000 participants since 10/7 from around the world. The Scholars Circle program hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues facing the Jewish community. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email as well within 1 week. Thank you to our recent donors and also to our annual sponsor, the University of Connecticut, through their Laboratory for the Study and Prevention of Global Anti-Semitism. We welcome audience questions anytime. Please use the Zoom Q&A box. Scholars Circle is a program of Chai Mitzvah, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Please consider supporting Scholars Circle with a donation, which is fully tax deductible. Dr. Olga Kirschbaum-Shirazki is a historian, editor, and co-founder of Tel Aviv Review of Books and visiting fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute. She received her PhD in modern European history from New York University, focusing on intergroup and interfaith relations, as well as nationalism, colonialism, and international politics in the modern world. Olga is a good friend of Chai Mitzvah, and we welcome you to Scholars Circle. Good afternoon, Olga. And since you're in Israel, I know it's evening for you.
Good afternoon, Audrey. So great to be back at Scholars Circle. Wonderful things you guys are doing.
Okay, so this is a very interesting topic. Some good news and some not good news. So let's start with some good news. Who are the Friends of Israel?
So I think it's first of all important to state how many friends Israel actually has, just as a general proposition, because I think a lot of people are experiencing all of the enemies and all of the anti-Semitism, everything from encampments on university to tremendous amount of anti-Semitism, and whether it's in kind of anti-Zionist forms online or even sort of a mishmash of anti-Zionist and sort of classic right-wing anti-Semitic forms online. And just so a lot of people are feeling overwhelmed. So I really, with this talk, I want people to sort of embrace that actually Israel has, in the words of many commentators, more friends, both regionally and internationally, than it has had in other periods of its history. So I think this may be a bit surprising to our listeners. It's not to diminish the problem with enemies, but it's to sort of set the stage that contrary to, for example, even the recent talk of Ram Emanuel at Tel Aviv University, where he sort of suggested that Israel was completely isolated, that simply is not the case. So let's start with the basic characteristics of what does it mean for a country to have friends. Okay, what are the characteristics of that? And I'm going to sort of give, I think, what is a sort of common sense definition is how many states are have diplomatic relations with the country. And that's the first thing. So Israel has diplomatic relations with the majority of countries in the world, right? So it has diplomatic relations with more countries than it doesn't, right? So that's the first point that's very important. The second point is that among the countries that it has diplomatic relations with, it has free trade agreements with a substantial number in Europe and South America, and elsewhere around the world. And then third point, which is important, is that it cooperates with countries also on sensitive matters. That means that it has cooperation in areas of energy, military cooperation, in some cases, intelligence cooperation, in addition to basic trade and the involvement of Israel in promoting technologies. One of the reasons countries like to cooperate with Israel is because Israel has a lot of technology, in addition to in the military area, in technology, water resource management, etc. So that's kind of on the state level, that there are a lot of states that have this basic definition of being friends, diplomatic ties, and then so that's sort of the most basic, and then the next level of friendship is economic ties, trade, etc., even free trade agreements, and then on an even greater level, development of ties in sort of strategic and sensitive areas. In addition to this, Israel is kind of part of a series of accords. So the Abraham Accords, for example, began as really just normalization agreements. So that means establishing diplomatic ties, but have extended to some of these other areas, right? So for countries that previously had no diplomatic ties, so extended to commercial ties and cooperation in sensitive military and other areas. That's on the state level for friends. And in the case of, there's sort of one more level of friendship, we can say, which is that there are a number of countries have moved their embassies from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And this is a significant level of friendship in the sense that it demonstrates that Jerusalem is Israel's own capital for itself. So it means that it's a level of friendship which sees and understands Israel in its own terms, right? And in addition to that, recognizes the historical relationship of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, to Jerusalem as its capital. So we have the majority of countries that have diplomatic ties with Israel don't have their embassy in Jerusalem, but we now have an increasing number of countries that do. There's one more area, again, I'm talking on the state level of friendship with Israel, and that's voting in international bodies. Right, so there we have some countries, and then finally, we'll get to that. This is involvement in direct military activity. So in terms of voting in international bodies, there are some countries that really stand out in terms of voting consistently for Israel on all number of resolutions. Usually, so a good example of this, there was an early resolution in October 2023, after October 7th, demanding an immediate ceasefire. So in this case, we have a series of countries that have voted against that. We have countries that voted in favor, and we have countries that abstained. The countries that voted against it have closer relations with Israel than the countries that abstained, for example. And there are many countries that voted for it that have diplomatic ties with Israel, but still voted for it. So countries that vote in the UN against resolutions that compromise Israeli security or territorial integrity, or Israel's room for maneuver and military action, are specifically countries in the Pacific Islands. They are, and I will get into the reasons why they are among the most consistent. So Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Tonga, Marshall Islands. Then in Europe, there are a couple of countries that have had a record consistently also within the EU itself. Czech, particularly Hungary. There are some countries that have flipped. The incoming president of Slovenia, or prime minister of Slovenia, I'm sorry, I have to check which one it is going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, and will, it seems, likely be voting in international bodies more in favor of Israel. So, and again, what does it mean in favor of Israel? It's security. What are the reasons? That's on the state level. And then on the level of non-state actors. So we have a number of stateless peoples, or people within the region that are have quite friendly relations with Israel. So within the Druze community are in a significant number Israeli citizens, but the Druze community outside of Israel, particularly some parts of the Druze community in Syria, but also increasingly in Lebanon, have friendly relations with Israel and are developing friendlier relationship with Israel, though it's somewhat divided. Another community regionally that is stateless, but that has autonomy in Iraq, for example, is Kurdistan, autonomous region of Iraq, which has friendly Kurds have friendly relations with Israel. So there's a lot of they're kind of between civil society organizations or individual politicians support for Israel, and vice versa. The foreign minister of Israel, Gideon Sa'ar, has voiced in various international fora support for autonomy for the Kurds, whether it was in Syria or whether it's in Iraq. So those are two other groups that have on the civil society level positive relations with Israelis and the state of Israel. And we have in many countries specific political parties that have a more positive stance towards Israel than their actual government. So we have political parties. And we have countries that have flip-flopped. So the case of Slovenia is a good example, where the outgoing prime minister was not favorable to Israel, and the current one is more, so is signaling that through the move of the embassy, and will be signaling that through the through voting measures in the UN. Although Slovenia had diplomatic relations with Israel. So those are and what is the basis for this friendship? So on the state level, the basis of the friendship are economic interests, right? There are reasons for these countries to be involved in trade with Israel and accept Israel's right as a sovereign country. And in addition to that, there are some countries, the ones that are most favorable to Israel, and we'll get to the United States in a moment, have a cultural respect for Israel and for the Jewish state. So the very probably the most friendly countries to Israel, the South Pacific countries, have many of them are strongly Christian and have a twofold support for the state of Israel. One of them is viewing Israel as an indigenous community that has returned to sovereignty, a vision that they have of themselves. And the second is an appreciation for Israel from a biblical perspective. They're Christian Zionists. Now, getting to the United States is probably still Israel's biggest friend, although the United States is very divided by party. And it has consistently in international bodies, it's an important trade partner, important military partner, so all the sensitive areas that I talked about, and also has been involved in these joint military activities, which is new in the Trump administration. One last point, then I guess, Audrey, you have another question, is there are a few other states in the region that are involved in highly sensitive areas, energy and arms, but who don't necessarily advertise their friendly relations, but whose populations, this is another point, there are countries who have friendly relations with Israel, including on this not just diplomatic relations and some economic ties, but who cooperate on sensitive matters. Some of them have divided populations, so there is some grassroots popular support, again, often among Christians, though not all Christians. There's some divisions between evangelicals and liberals, and even among evangelicals. Sometimes for cultural reasons, they view Israel as a model for them, whether for a return to sovereignty or a strong nation state. And sometimes it's for a geopolitical balance, right? So a country in the region that has strong ties with Israel, though they are, I would say, somewhat modest about them, is Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan works with Israel on very sensitive areas of energy and security cooperation. And for Azerbaijan, there are geostrategic reasons. Azerbaijan maintains good relations with neighbors, but it has very strong neighbors like Turkey, Iran, and Russia. And so cooperating with Israel gives Azerbaijan a kind of leverage in terms of their independence. Audrey.
Okay. Well, that's good news. That's very good news. We need more good news. Okay, so you have friends, and then you have another category called frenemies. So what is a frenemy?
Right. So diplomatic relations. So as I mentioned, starting out, Israel, despite the claims of Israel being, and these I think are actually quite preposterous claims, right? That we're constantly being bombarded with this idea that Israel is completely isolated. Okay. This is not true. If Israel were completely isolated, it would be sanctioned by tens of countries. Its economy would be in ruins. It wouldn't be doing trade. It wouldn't have free trade agreements, and it would certainly not be collaborating with countries on sensitive military areas. And it would not be, and it would not have admirers and people. That being said, we do have, and this is why the frenemy category is important, and I think this is what people are noticing, particularly in the United States, which has a party that I would argue is in part in the frenemy camp and in part in the enemy camp, and we can get to that officially. And we have parts of the Republican Party that is also in the frenemy and enemy camp, although right now the Trump administration, I would say, is for the most part in the friends camp, is that frenemies are countries that have diplomatic relations with Israel, do trade with Israel, but that have been hostile in other ways to Israel. So whether it's arms embargoes, so we've had a couple of countries that during the course of the war after October 7th, the seven-front war that Israel has been involved with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the Iranians, in addition to Iraqi militias, etc. So in that war for the state of Israel's survival, because again, it is not, I think I gave another scholars circle talk where I was very clear that there is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict outside of this larger regional conflict. There's no Palestinian organization that is not funded, trained, or works together with other states or civil society organizations, etc. So in this seven-front war, there are countries that have stopped arms shipments. So these are where they have an agreement to where Israel has bought arms and they've stopped arms shipments. These are countries that have called for an immediate ceasefire, even though, according to international law, Israel was attacked and had absolutely every right to defend itself and also to defeat the belligerent, right? Self-defense, according to international law, does not depend on simply pushing back. You can defeat an enemy in international law. So these countries, and then these are countries that consistently or that have countries that have not officially prescribed organizations that call for the destruction of the state of Israel. So these that would be the IRGC, or that would be Hamas, that would be Hezbollah. So take a country like Norway, for example, has not officially prescribed countries like or has not the IRGC and Hamas. Their reasoning for that is that they're not officially prescribed by the UN. There are other areas that have been late in doing so, like the European Union, which has done so only in the last 2 years. So the frenemies are countries that have an ambivalent record in terms of understanding Israel's strategic situation and understanding that Israel is joined, and this is where there's a kind of disconnect between the friends and the frenemies. So the friends regionally that I spoke about, for example, the Kurds and the Druze, or I spoke about the Azerbaijanis, or I spoke about the Abraham Accords, these are all countries where the Islamist movements are illegal, or these are groups that are strongly anti-Islamist, like the Kurds who fought against ISIS. So these groups, though not involved in a formal military alliance with Israel, are aligned with Israel insofar as they view the Iranian state as the primary problem in the region. And so they do not consider Israel to be the primary destabilizing problem in the region. In fact, many of them consider Israel to be the solution in the region, right, as to a cornerstone of a new and democratic Middle East. And so that also includes other minoritized communities in Syria and in Lebanon. We are now seeing peace negotiations, the desire to get rid of Hezbollah on the part of the Lebanese state. Whether it will achieve that or not is another question, than normalized relations. So Kazakhstan is another country that's joined the Abraham Accords, where the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist organizations are illegal, and which has this sort of general anti-Islamist orientation. The frenemies are countries who are not at the front lines of Islamist attacks, and who are interested in stability, and who are persuaded, in my view, contrary to any empirical evidence, that stability will be achieved by a balance of power between Israel and Iran, and by integrating Iran and other Islamists into the international system. And so these frenemies are consistently, through that strategic logic, consistently putting pressure on Israel, not only with regard to the Palestinian issue, even though the Palestinian leadership is very hostile to Israel, including the PLO, with their pay for slave program, with their sort of own, although they're still officially on the Oslo course, with their ideology. I want to discuss another element of the frenemies, which is that the friends of Israel generally have a public discourse at the least, so I would say the lowest level of friend, that is not hostile to Jewish national self-determination and views it as a natural, just like other national groups have statehood, or other states view it as a natural thing and are not hostile to it, and do not have a discourse hostile to Jewish national self-determination or to the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And even some of them, and even sort of higher level among the friends of Israel, are countries that admire the state of Israel in its relationship to its past, its recovery of its language, its developments, etc., culturally, and its religion, right? The frenemies tend to accept the state of Israel de facto, not de jure, meaning that the state of Israel exists, and therefore we accept it, but we don't really see any value in the state of Israel. We don't really have any respect for Jewish culture. Okay, it's a culture among other cultures. We do business with the state of Israel. We accept it as a state because it was voted by the UN, but we don't see any value in Jewish or Israeli culture. We have interests with the state of Israel on certain matters, but our regional interest is primarily in instability, which we think can be better achieved through a negotiated agreement with the Iranians, or can be achieved because, and many of these countries have significant portions of the population that view the state of Israel as de jure illegitimate, de facto legitimate, but de jure illegitimate. That means that they've accepted the right-wing Arab nationalist discourse that Palestine really should have been an Arab state. The Jews got a state because of the Holocaust, and okay, now it exists, so we're going to accept it, but it wasn't really just. So the frenemies have significant either political parties or parts of their population that have those perspectives, and those are very much seen in the way that the frenemies invest, and some of the invest their money. So they will invest in Palestinian organizations without any strings attached, or have only recently put strings in terms of radicalization in education, anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist education, violent education, that would be that the existence of that type of curricula would be a reason for them to stop funding UNRWA or funding civil society organizations. So many frenemies are in Europe. They are number one funders of Palestinian civil society organizations, civil organizations, which are hostile to the state of Israel, its existence, and hostile and do not see Jewish national self-determination as legitimate, and have a far-right Arab nationalist position in terms of the sort of Arab-Palestinian kind of perspective or vision of a one-state Palestine, or if they are two-state, only sort of de facto and not de jure. So the frenemies invest their civil society organizations, put a lot of money. So a country like Norway, Palestine is the number one recipient of foreign aid, much more so than any other stateless group like the Kurds or other areas. And in fact, the situation with Norway has degenerated significantly. Norway could probably be put in the enemy camp or close to, between the frenemy and the enemy camp. And we can get to that. Another frenemy parties, the sort of civil society and communication angle is again on a lack of any cultural appreciation for Jews or the state of Israel compared to the sort of the Friends, and or at most a de facto recognition of it, and rather than a de jure. Audrey?
Okay. So we've done friends and frenemies, and now who are our true enemies?
So the enemies of the state of Israel, of course, first and foremost at this point are the countries who are officially at war with the state of Israel, with whom we have no diplomatic relations, and who have as an objective, a stated objective, the destruction of the state of Israel. So those are most obvious enemies. So of course, the most important one is Iran and its proxies. Iran has not only this is an stated objective, but it has invested an unbelievable amount of money, energy, human capital, talent in moving this project forward, including putting proxies in foreign countries to surround Israel in what has now become a seven-front war. So the Houthis, Hezbollah, the Shiite militias in Iraq, they've been involved in influence operations in Jordan, which has a border with Israel. I should add that countries like Jordan and Egypt are frenemies insofar as they have diplomatic relations with Israel, but they have very little commercial cooperation, and they still have very strong anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist culture within these countries. Very little tourism, and that's very different from the Abraham Accord partners, where there is a move towards an appreciation for Judaism and for Israel culturally, and a rejection of this kind of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So these are the primary enemies, and along with that are the Muslim Brotherhood and countries that don't have, old Arab League countries that are still officially at war or have an anti-normalization policy. That's no diplomatic relations with the state of Israel. So that includes Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, various other countries that have not officially ended their state of war or are not normalized with Israel. So those are the enemies. Cuba has no diplomatic relations with Israel. So these are countries, and these are countries that are openly in, whether it's in the International Criminal Court, are openly trying to criminalize. So they, contrary to the Friends of Israel, view Israel as the primary problem, and many of them are in fact allied with the Iranian regime. Now there are countries that have diplomatic and commercial relations with the state, with Iran, without supporting an Islamist policy. So they have what's called in diplomatic terms a good neighbor policy. So a country like Azerbaijan is a country like that. Azerbaijan has diplomatic relations with Iran, has trade with Iran. That's their good neighbor policy, even though it has an anti-Islamist politics domestically and has good relations with Israel. So it's not having diplomatic relations with Iran necessarily that puts people in the enemy camp, even though Iran is a state dedicated. We have to understand how extreme this is. It's a state whose stated goals is the destruction of the state of Israel. Okay, we do not have very many other examples of this in modern history, where the stated goal, we have this in modern Jewish history, where the stated goal of the Nazis was the war against European Jewry and the destruction of the Jews, became a more and more obvious stated goal, even though we don't have the writ of the final solution. So we have also very strong parties within countries like Muslim Brotherhood parties in countries that have diplomatic relations like Egypt that would like to see the destruction of the state of Israel. So, and then we have the proxies and the militias that have joined the war, and the countries that previously were at war during the wars 67, 73, and the wars of the Druze. So those are the enemies of Israel. And then there are some groups that are frenemies, in that they are not who are really verging almost towards the enemy camp, insofar as they are not involved on a military basis in the war against Israel, but their national culture is so hostile to Israel on the communications front that they are joining. If today warfare is viewed primarily as hybrid between military warfare and then communications warfare, they're viewed as almost enemies. So Ireland is a case in point. Ireland is one of the countries in Europe that does not have a pro-Israel party. Most countries in Europe have at least one party that is, if not highly friends with Israel, more sort of, I would call, low-level friends with Israel at the least. Ireland doesn't really even have that, and so Israel has cut diplomatic ties with Ireland. Norway is another country that has, unlike Sweden, does not really have a pro-Israel party, very high donor. Although, Norway in 2019 did reevaluate its kind of policy of giving without demanding accountability from UNRWA and the Palestinian Authority, but still. So we have, and then we have parties, we have countries that have this kind of commercial but have significant enemy populations within them, and parties that are beginning to advocate an enemy policy. So an enemy policy would be an arms embargo on Israel, which would make Israel, without until Israel is fully independent in their arms production. An arms embargo on Israel is an enemy position for the state of Israel, insofar as it means that Israel cannot defend itself. So parties within countries that have diplomatic ties with Israel that are calling for an arms embargo would be in the enemy camp, and countries that are or parties that do not see a problem with a nuclear Iran, right? Who not only are not looking for a negotiated solution. Most countries in Europe and North America and the Americas do not want a nuclear Iran, but there are some parties who do not see nuclear Iran, don't see a problem with that. Those would be considered enemy parties or civil society groups. And then enemies on the communications front are those that are not only don't accept the legitimacy of the state of Israel among the community of nations based on the principle of national self-determination of the Jewish people, but are vilifying the Israel with all kinds of libelous accusations that are completely detached from reality, that Israel is a settler colonial state, as if it were similar to Australia and Canada, even though nobody's calling for the end of Canada and Australia, or not to the same degree as they're calling for the end of the state of Israel. Israel still is not historically parallel to the states of the former British Empire for a series of very obvious reasons, not least of which is that Jews have a historical relationship to the land of Israel, which the British do not have with Canada. But so that in the communications area, that there's a tremendous amount of lies, and these, of course, are countries that are seeking to vilify and flip the narrative. So whereas Israel has no stated goal of destroying the project of Iranian or of the Iranian state, but rather defending itself. These are groups that are accusing Israel of genocide, that are vilifying, that are using Nazi analogies. These are all groups that are trying to make Israel criminal so that its destruction would be viewed as a moral duty by those listening. So those would also be enemies of Israel, and they are unfortunately increasingly being represented in both far left parties in Western Europe, in the Anglosphere, so that's in South American countries, and also in some parts of the American right. I want to add that there's one other category of friends. We've talked about Africa. We haven't spoken about as much except for the South Pacific, Africa, Korea, Japan, and China. These are all countries that are low-level friends with Israel. And then there's India, which has upgraded its friendship with Israel recently. So the low-level friends, meaning that they have diplomatic relations, have trade relations, but they balance their relations with their commercial and diplomatic ties and interests with countries that are enemies or frenemies with Israel. And therefore, they, whereas they don't necessarily have a hostile, totally hostile voting record, they tend to seek, as with the Europeans, some kind of accommodation with Iran, for example, and do not, unlike the local friends of Israel, and that includes also, by the way, Iranian Democrats or whether local Iranian Democrats or Iranian Democrats in the diaspora, see Israel as part of the solution for a more stable and prosperous Middle East, or Abraham Accords partners. There's one other country in the region that I would call between a frenemy to an enemy is Turkey. Turkey is in a kind of anomalous position of having had diplomatic relations for a long time, although they've been basically broken off, but being on good terms with Israel's closest partners, the United States, and being part of NATO, but at the same time hosting Israel's enemies, and it seems looking for some kind of balance of power and diplomatic solution with Iran.
Okay. That was really informative and very nuanced, and it was something that I think we all learned quite a bit about. We get so bombarded with all the negative. To parse it out in this way was very, very helpful. There are some questions that I'd like to get to. So Roz asks, what do you make of the EU attempting to pass a law to boycott products from Judah and Samaria?
Well, this is again part of the EU's broader strategy for the Middle East and their broader, I would say, cultural position vis-a-vis Israel. So unlike indigenous communities, which see Israel as, this wonderful example of return to sovereignty after having lost it, or Christian communities that view Israel, have a tremendous respect for Israel and the Jewish people's relationship to the land. Many parties and many states in the EU really only see Israel or recognize it de facto rather than de jure. So some of them view it as a reasonable position for Jewish national self-determination in the context of modern national self-determination, but many of them sort of view it as a sort of a necessity after the Holocaust, but as a sort of destabilizing force. So that's an important, if they see that Israel was created on the basis of an injustice towards the Palestinians. So they are very invested in two things. They're invested in regional stability through economic integration and through diplomatic relations. And by the way, this was the EU's policy. Look at Merkel with Russia, an absolutely failed policy, one might add. But this is their preferred diplomatic approach. They also don't have a coordinated army. And they have, they're ideologically committed to this economic integration and diplomacy. And they're also not on the front lines with any Islamist powers. So they have an interest in the market of Iran and Iranian oil, having good relations with Turkey, etc. And so they would rather put pressure on Israel. And then many of them, of course, rather than seeing and understanding Jewish national self-determination in this context of their own history, where many small European countries got national self-determination after more than 1,000 years of imperial rule after World War I, and that the same was supposed to happen in the Middle East with the Assyrians, the Kurds, the Maronite Christians, and the Jews. Instead of understanding history for what it was, they have this view, they have adopted the Arab nationalist paradigm, that then the Levant is an Arab nationalist area with a few minorities, and the Jews lucked out getting their state because they were murdered in Europe. So that ideological complex and their own economic and military interests mean that they keep on doubling down on the two-state solution with a Palestinian capital, right? Because they also don't see any religious significance to Israel, and they don't have a problem in giving in sort of they don't view the religious dimension as important, so they're not even really committed into demanding that Muslims reconsider their relationship with Judaism, right? So Islam has traditionally a replacement theology vis-a-vis Judaism, as does Christianity traditionally, and that was addressed in part through Vatican II, and so part of what makes the Abraham Accords quite remarkable is that it also includes a kind of religious reconciliation, whether with Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, whereas the Europeans, they don't care about that. So they are perfectly happy for Muslims to control all of Jewish holy sites and the rest of it, as long as they think that if the Palestinians have a state and there is an arrangement with Iran, that the Middle East will be stabilized, they can have commercial relations, and everything will work out. And many of them also think that is the just solution for the Palestinian Arabs. So that's where they're standing. I think this is strategically, culturally, for the future and for peace. I think this is a misunderstanding of the situation, and I think it's the wrong strategy. But let's go on to the next question.
Well, you touch on a lot of things there. There's a question about Qatar's relationship with Israel. Why is it so different than the other Gulf states?
Well, so Qatar, unlike, so the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, they have, they're sort of kind of conservative, both of them, conservative Muslim, but the Qataris came under the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that sort of, there's a whole story behind that. Yusuf Qaradawi, who was an Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood leader, took refuge in Qatar and had a strong influence on the Qatari, the family, the ruling family of Qatar. And so Qatar has as a Muslim Brotherhood ideology, whereas the Emirates don't have a Muslim Brotherhood ideology, and the Saudis also don't have a Muslim Brotherhood ideology. In fact, in Trump 1, the Saudis tried to isolate Qatar. It's called the Qatari diplomatic crisis in 2016, and which was they embargoed it, and they demanded the end of Al Jazeera. They demanded it stop incitement and the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. This is a whole sort of issue in itself, why the Saudi attempt was scuttled, and it was scuttled in part by the Americans. In terms of the Qataris, the thing is that the Qataris have good relations with many in the West, many frenemies of Israel. And so they are kind of they're not a declared enemy in the same open way that the Iranians are, but they have very strong ties with the Iranians and support, the destruction of Israel. They're a very strong fountain of incitement on the communications area, but they're weak militarily. They're strong in the communications area. And so why are they different from the Gulf? Because they've chosen this path. The Emirates have chosen a different path with Israel and with Islam, which led to the Abraham Accords. They were interested also in Israel for technological reasons, for balancing their power in relation to the Saudis and in relation to Qatar. And so they found that to be a useful path to take. So there was geostrategic, ideological reasons for this divergence.
So if you had to weigh the cultural boycotts or the cultural anti-Israel sentiment versus the diplomatic, what would you put more emphasis on? Because it seems as though even these countries, we keep seeing that Israel's losing the cultural wars. They're losing the messaging. They're losing even among countries that are diplomatically have good relations or trade relations or other, how important is that if you're losing the cultural war? And
okay, so first of all, we have to understand where they're losing the cultural war, and because that very much matters. So I think this is very sort of disconcerting for the Jewish diaspora, which is primarily located in the Anglosphere, so the United States, largest of all, but also Canada, Australia, South Africa, and in Western Europe and little bits of South America. And these are areas where the diaspora community traditionally felt that these countries supported the state of Israel, and there didn't create a lot of tension for people to be openly Zionist and openly proud of their Jewish heritage, and to also be proud Canadians and Americans. There's always been a strong, I would say maybe less anti-Jewish and less anti-Semitic in the sense of racial anti-Semitism, and in the sense of a kind of Catholic anti-Judaism or Orthodox anti-Judaism, or some sort of in the way of the pre-Vatican II. That's maybe been less strong in the United States, maybe a little bit more in other parts of the Anglosphere. But what's happened is that an anti-Zionism that was part of the American left has now become dominant in many areas of the culture, and now has become extremely dominant in the Democratic Party, to the point where the Democratic Party is considering an arms embargo on Israel, which I said would put the United States almost in the enemy camp of Israel, at least collaborating with the enemies. They wouldn't be actively destroying the state of Israel, but they would certainly be facilitating those who want to, if they're doing an active arms embargo. So that is very disconcerting. And there are countries that have varying degrees of difference between their state policies and their popular sentiment. So one country like that is Greece, where there's been significant rapprochement on the state level, because Greece has a very big interest in military and intelligence cooperation with Israel, and energy cooperation because of tensions with Erdogan's Turkey. At the same time, anti-Zionism is very popular in Greece. So I would say, to answer the question, I needed to give this framework. The interests are very important, and the interests can outweigh popular anti-Zionism, including what I would call, anti-Zionism is irrational. It's a projection, right? So it's a waste of time. It's a kind of pathological perspective. And so, but even countries that have a significant political movements, or whose institutions are captured in large part by that, the academy, journalism, the arts, can still have significant parts of their economy or industry that have interests in having good ties with Israel. And those can be sufficient to counterbalance things. I would say, that being said, the cultural dimension and we do have places where the cultural dimension is positive. Azerbaijanis as a people, in addition to having the state having a geostrategic good relations for interest related energy, Azerbaijan's geostrategic balance, and the rest of it, military cooperation. Azerbaijanis as a whole have a good are positively disposed to Israelis. And to Israel. That is the preferred situation. It's better for the society itself. Societies that engage in anti-Zionism are diverting precious resources from their own policies, their own societies, and the rest of it. Whether the countries in the Anglosphere in Western Europe that are have significant parties that are frenemies or that have captured cultural groups will change in the next few years is hard to know. And what this will mean in the long term. And so Israel is preparing for this. So Israel is preparing for a potentially frenemy, if not hostile, American government after Trump, is very much monitoring who is within the Trump administration, is developing its doctrine of having relations with lots of other countries. And this is not new. Ben-Gurion was very interested. Ben-Gurion was very aware of great power politics, as are all the Israeli leadership, and so you have to be careful with great powers. At the same time, was very keen to develop relations across the world, and Israel is continuing to do that, really stressing what it has to offer in technology and the rest of it, so that if the culture is absent, then the other thing is rewarding countries. So, for example, even though the countries of again related to this cultural. Countries in the South Pacific are not large countries, and they're not big trading partners. So there isn't a huge there's some military interest, but they have been loyal in the sense that they have shown clearly to be friends of Israel in international bodies, and Israel has therefore invested in diplomatic embassies in these countries because the cultural dimension is important, and it has concrete impact in international bodies. So Israel has a two-pronged impact. I think both are important. I think that sometimes the cultural can override interests. Sometimes interests can override cultural, and that depends entirely on the specific geopolitical dimension. And sometimes countries can completely flip from one to the other if they have a divided population. We mentioned Slovenia. Colombia is another example. Colombia had long-standing cultural had a divided population in terms of support for Israel, with some supporters, some not, had close strategic military intelligence cooperation, technological cooperation, and then moved to a very hostile government, which cut off diplomatic relations after October 7th, and now has again changed with a new government. And is interested in joining the Isaac Accords, right? So, or at least actually hold off on that. I don't know exactly what Colombia's position is on that, but the Isaac Accords are now being sort of are seen as a regional kind of option by the Argentinian president. Wants it to be sort of a regional set of accords. Yes, Audrey.
I never heard that term. What is the Isaac Accords or the Abraham?
Yeah. Oh, so let's talk. The Isaac Accords are very important. So the Isaac Accords are modeled on the Abraham Accords. They were started by the Argentine president Milei, and the idea. So these are accords with countries that already have diplomatic relations with Israel, but they are a strengthening of the diplomatic relations. They are the countries. So Argentina is, openly, in their political discourse said that, that there's a kind of choice to be made between the Iranian regime and Israel, that there are some times in history you have to be on the right side of history. So a very clear, unlike the European frenemies who just want a balance of power, are clearly taking a stand against the IRGC and the Islamic Republic of Iran and its proxies as a nefarious force, and so outlying all of these organizations. And in addition to that, looking for closer military, strategic, technological ties with Israel, and moving the embassies to Jerusalem, again, as this sign of increased sort of respect for Jewish culture, and for the state of Israel as a sort of not just a de facto sort of a state that one should have diplomatic ties with, but as a positive good culturally.
Okay. There's many questions. We're not going to get to them all, but we will send them all to you. And I want you to have a moment to wrap things up and to tell us about your book and your Substack and some of the other things that you've been working on. But one last question I think is on everybody's mind, which I will find right now. They said, of the remaining World Cup teams, England, Spain, and Argentina, which one is most friendly towards Israel?
Oh, well, there's no doubt that Argentina is the most friendly. At least Argentina does have a subset and has parties that are hostile to Israel. So it's not that Argentina is entirely friendly to Israel, but the current Argentine government is exceptionally friendly to Israel. And not only that, but wants to see an entire bloc integrated into the Isaac Accords. And again, the name of the Isaac Accords, like the Abraham Accords, is significant because it includes this cultural appreciation of Judaism and includes a reconciliation on a kind of religious cultural level, which doesn't, for example, exist between Egypt and Jordan, which have diplomatic ties. So I want to say I have had the good fortune of working in this area. In working with Chen Mazik, he had a conference, New Middle East, which brought together Middle Eastern, both Democrats from majority countries that are against Islamism, Iran, Turkey, Arabs from Iraq, Lebanon, etc., and brought together minoritized populations, Kurds. Kurds are actually quite large in number, but minoritized in the sense that they don't have national self-determination, who view who do not take the balance of power approach, who do not see the conflict as primarily an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, who do not think you can make a deal with the Iranians, the Iranian regime, but rather who think that a new Middle East will come with the defeat of the Islamic Republic and with countries that are aligned with this Abraham Accords viewpoint. And so that this is an important development. And we've seen, I think maybe some of your viewers have seen that now in relation to, there's a new Muslim group that is opposing boycotts. They're increasingly, so there are anti-Islamist Muslims or Middle Eastern people who are anti-Islamist, who are aligned with Israel and who are friendly to Israel, who, and who have, who good, are good. This, I think, is getting more and more traction. And I think that it's very important for American Jews to understand this, that there's a lot of American Jews are still stuck within the, Rahm Emanuel was a very good example of the European, the paradigm is an Israeli-Arab, it's a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and you have to just make a deal. There's no military solutions for the IRGC, etc. And so that's, I think that it's important to note that this is not just an Israeli position. It's not just a right wing or Netanyahu's position. This is a position that has a lot of supporters within the Middle East itself and has supporters like Milei, people who across the world. There is also a group, it's a minority group on the left, but who are anti-Islamist for traditional left-wing reasons. They see the Islamists as fascists and against women's rights, etc. And they think that it is abhorrent and absurd that so many left-wing parties are forming an alliance with the Islamists across Western Europe, the Americas, and elsewhere, including South Africa and other places. So I have a book that discusses many of these issues. It's called From Anti-Zionism to a New Middle East. I would say that that it's really important to look at the friends. I think that I think that's important for the American Jewish community, who are the majority of listeners here today in Chai Mitzvah, but not only to be grateful to our friends, to learn about our friends. We, one of the things that some of our friends show great interest in the state of Israel, and the state of Israel is in return showing interest in them, and that's important because friendship is mutual. These are mutual relations. I think it's important for us to foster, one of the things the American Jews can do is look up people who have read. There's there's a recent book that came out by Wicked Sung Press called The Arab Case for Israel, who's I'm going to mispronounce it. I forget the exact name of the author, so people can look it up. I don't want to misname it. But to look at different people, to show appreciation, to hear what they're saying, to understand, to learn about our neighbors, so our friends in the region of Israel, to learn about the people internationally who support Israel, who support Jews in the diaspora. Many of the supporters of Israel, by the way, are also supporters of protections for Jews in the diaspora. And to move, I think we are in a new paradigm. I think for a long time, the American Jewish community counted on liberal and left liberal, and maybe some center, counted in the United States, counted on a bipartisan consensus about Israel, but viewed, had a political home among the liberals and the liberal left. And today, I'm not talking about what people's views, people should vote whatever they want on policy, whether it's Medicare, economic policies for the United States, but to let go, to look more at what I think it's educational for American Jews to look at what Israel's friends are saying about Israel. I think that will be very eye-opening for a lot of people in diaspora.
We'll put your book in the follow-up email, and in the follow-up email that we'll be sending to everybody. This lecture has been recorded. It will be on our website, chaimitzvah.org, in just a week. And thank you. It was such an enlightening and wonderful conversation. You have so much to offer, Olga. We're so glad that you found us again. And we look forward to finding your Substack and reading the book. I'd like to invite everybody to our next Scholars Circle lecture, which will feature Dr. Asaf Romanetsky on the purpose of higher education, the crisis facing America's campuses. That will be on Tuesday, the 28th of July at 7 p.m. It's another evening lecture, Tuesday, the 28th of July at 7 p.m. And thank you all for making this afternoon or evening for you, Olga, and be well and be safe. And we'll be speaking to you again soon, we hope. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.